so Paul writes, For if you were cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these who are the natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? In other words, if God is able to do all of this for you Gentiles, who, like Jacob, were not even destined to be the heir, how much more could he do for the Jewish people if they chose to believe and he was able to graft them in through their faith? And so Paul writes, For I do not want you, brethren, to be uninformed of this mystery. Why? So that you will not be wise in your own estimation. And so Paul doesn't want people to feel puffed up, not even against Israel. Rather, they should feel some sense of fear. In other words, what if I had continued in hardness? Wouldn't I be in the same boat as them? Wouldn't I be in rebellion? Wouldn't I be putting up a fight? Wouldn't I be cut off from the Messiah? And so Paul writes that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Come into what? Come into Israel. What Israel are we talking about? The Israel that Paul spoke of in the beginning of these videos, which we covered. Well, Paul said, not all those who are of Israel are Israel, and not all those who are of the flesh are counted as the seed. Not all of Abraham's descendants are counted, of Abraham's children are counted as the seed. And he says a partial hardening has happened until the fullness of the Gentiles should come in. Come into what? Come into the Israel of God. The Israel of faith. The Israel of faith. If you followed these videos, you have had a chance to see in every case the Apostle Paul lay out the story, the explanation of who is Israel. And in every story, Israel in God's sight is the party of faith. That's the same word that John the Baptist spoke and the same thing that Jesus said. Jesus told the Pharisees that they were not. He said, if you were Abraham's children, you would do the deeds of Abraham. But now you seek to kill me. You are of your father, the devil. In other words, just being Abraham's descendant after the flesh, that's not good enough in God's sight. That actually doesn't necessarily count. What counts is faith. As Paul wrote in Galatians chapter 3, know this, only those who are of faith are the children of Abraham. So Paul's explaining here. Yeah, the hardening has happened. Yeah, God has allowed these people to rebel. But at the same time, God's mercy is coming to those who believe. And in this case, for all the Jewish people who didn't believe, God's mercy is coming to the Gentiles. And so, Paul writes, and so all Israel will be saved. Or we can say in this manner, all Israel will be saved. What Israel? The Israel that Paul defined in the 9th chapter of Romans, when he said, not all those who are of Israel are Israel. In this manner, all of the Israel of faith will be saved. Israel, the Israel of faith. How do we know that to be true? Because he says right here that the number of the Gentiles will be fulfilled. And according to the flesh, well, let me ask you, Are the Gentiles Israel? According to this, no, they're not. Yet right here Paul says, for the number of the Gentiles shall be fulfilled, and in this manner all of Israel shall be saved. What Israel is Paul talking about? He's talking about the group of people who believe. The group of people who believe. He's talking about Isaac. He's talking about Jacob. He's talking about Moses. He's talking about the Babylonian men who lived in the land when the Israelites were kicked out. He's talking about the group of people who believe. And the only way you can understand this is if you read everything that Paul has to say about this. That's why I'm covering everything. Because if we were to just take one verse out of context here, or we could make this book say anything. And that's not what the apostles did, and that's not what God inspired them to do, and that's not what I'm going to do. So, Paul explains. He says that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in, and so all Israel will be saved. That's Jew, Greek, Gentile, that's the believers. Now what happens after that hardening happens? It doesn't get better. Remember, in Pharaoh's case, that actually brought about the divine justice of God. And what was going to happen to the nation of Israel? Well, Jesus outlined very clearly, Matthew 24, when he spoke of the temple. He said, not one stone shall be left standing upon another. Now, modern people would say, well, what about the foundational stones? I mean, are they going to take those out too? Yeah, they did. Why? Because 40 years later, in 70 AD, when the temple was destroyed, which the Jews actually set on fire themselves, you can read in Josephus, the gold in the temple literally melted from the heat. And the gold seeped down into the cracks of the foundation. And the Romans, eager to get the gold out of the cracks in the foundation, literally tore all the foundational stones out of the ground in order to get the gold. Yeah, every stone. Every stone. Not one stone shall be left standing. All will be torn down. And the world saw that those apostles were not so crazy after all. So, Paul writes, and so all Israel, that's Israel, including the Gentiles, Israel of faith, all Israel will be saved. Remember in John wrote, he came unto his own, and his own received him not. But as to as many as received him, to them he gave power to become sons of God. And so, Paul quotes from the prophets, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will remove ungodliness from Jacob. This is my covenant with them when I take away their sins forever. What did Jesus say to the high priest? Unless you believe in me, you will die in your sins. Who's Paul speaking of? The Israel after the flesh? No. We have chapters of Paul explaining who Israel is in God's sight. God sees after faith. God views in terms of faith, not in terms of biology. He views in terms of faith. If it was a matter of biology, the Jews would have been in the door. We have Abraham as our father. So Paul explains here. From the standpoint of the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. But from the standpoint of God's choice, they're beloved for the sake of the fathers. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. Yeah, that's right. Look at the blessing that God bestowed upon the Jewish people through the Old Covenant, to know who he is, and really to be prepared for the gospel. But through unbelief, just like Esau, they forfeited that right. And so Paul explains,